Hi, and welcome to the OrgDev podcast. We're absolutely delighted to be joined by Jag Johal today. Jag has a fascinating role in a fascinating organisation. He is HR Director of Agile Transformation at Jaguar Land Rover. He's been at Jaguar Land Rover over 20 years now, and in that time he's had roles at all different parts of the business, including engineering, product, distribution, sales and marketing, and has extensive experience both UK and globally. He's been HR Director of Agile Transformation for the last 3.5 years, and his connection to this podcast is he actually met Danny at Roffey Park. Is that right, Danny?
Yes, good few years back, we were both on the Organisation Development Practitioners Programme for 9 intense days. So,
which I'm sure we'll talk about at some point, because Roffey Park is a connection between lots of OD practitioners as well. So, Jag, thank you so much for joining us, and thanks so much for making time for us today.
No problem. Lovely to be here and be speaking to you both.
Likewise, welcome. So we're just going to kick off with an easy question. So just tell us a bit about your role. So tell us a bit more about being HR Director of Agile Transformation. What does that involve?
Wide and varied role, probably fair to say. We've spent a lot of our time over the last few years, really, I guess, since the start of the programme in terms of mobilisation and education. So I think I've been quite open with lots of people that, I find myself in this position, but at the start of this, I could spell the word agile and I knew what Scrum was on a rugby pitch, and that was kind of where my starting place was. But similarly, while we have pockets of expertise in our organisation, for lots of people this was a brand new journey as well. So a lot of what we've been doing is coaching people, educating people, engaging people in the journey that we're trying to take, and really kind of building their knowledge up of how do you work in this kind of construct, what are the kind of practices, the ceremonies, things to watch out for, the anti-patterns that kind of occur. But we are talking about a really significant scale, sort of when we started probably upwards of 8,000, we're probably somewhere close to about 12,000, 13,000, I think, people who are working in this system now. So it's a big old undertaking to be able to do that. A lot of change, a lot of comms in there in terms of supporting people through that journey. That in itself has been an interesting approach, and probably something we might touch upon during the course of the rest of this conversation about how well we have done that or how well we haven't done it in some places and what we could have done better. But it underlies the importance of genuine, proper, good change management to support people through a journey. And while we're still doing continuing mobilisation, education, building maturity of people's understanding of this approach, a lot of actually what we're starting to do now is seeing where this all integrates itself into the broader programme delivery system or where it doesn't. So when we first started this, I was kind of told that one of the things you'll end up doing, Jag, is kind of identifying all of the rub points and the tension points that exist in this organisation. It'd probably be fair to say we found them. Certainly a lot of them, and we're still discovering as we go through. And part of our job now is kind of trying to really distill them and figure out which ones are the ones that are causing us the biggest pain. How do we go about resolving them? And that, of course, may not be my direct team that are resolving them, because we don't own that particular process or system or tooling infrastructure. But it is about trying to integrate things so that actually we are making the lives of our people as productive as possible, and we can make Agile as a system work. So knitting all of that together is sort of a big part of the challenge at the moment.
And what was the driver behind bringing in that agile transformation? What were you trying to achieve?
Fundamentally, we need to recorrect our delivery of our vehicles on time, to cost, to quality. And not just in that context, we also know that the competition is moving faster and faster. So we've being able to stay relevant in this industry is important. The barriers to competition have probably come down a little over the last few years. And it's not just traditional competitors that we're going up against. There are new ones coming up all the time, particularly in electric vehicles. So this was very much about how do we ensure that we are a genuinely competitive, sustainable business going into the future. And obviously products, and in this instance, vehicles, are our lifeblood.
Lovely, thank you. So how has OD helped you do that role? So you've not got organisation development in the title, but how have you applied the mindset to the approach you take?
I think the thing that really struck me, probably 6 to 9 months after I was kind of working in this space is I guess I realized I've always been doing Agile. I just didn't know it in terms of the language or some of the tools or processes or ways of working. So because a lot of, I suppose, what I've done during my career are things like org design type projects, ranging from reduction of workforce type stuff that we have to do through to actually designing and setting up new organization constructs. But within that, how do sort of systems come together? Where have you got blockages in the way things are working? Where have you got waste? How do you optimize yourselves for delivering whatever product system that you are trying to deliver? Which in essence is a lot of what Agile is actually all about. Have you set your teams up to be as optimal as possible, taking things out of their way, maximizing their time to do delivery work, etc. So it's been a learning curve, no doubt about it, in terms of some of the more technical aspects of Agile, for want of a better phrase. But I think what has really helped me is that OD lens. I guess I've always carried and been improving, hopefully, over the years, very relevant in what we're doing today, both in terms of not just the way things are organized from a system perspective, but also a big part of Agile and successful adoption of Agile is all about mindset. So you can have all of the best set Scrum ceremonies that you like, or Kanban or Jira boards or whatever it is. But actually a big premise of all of this is, have you got people, not just leadership, but people in the place where they're willing to embrace change, they're willing to embrace a different way of working, challenging known ways, challenging status quo, challenging each other, up, down, sideways. And fundamentally at the base of it, have you got an environment that is going to encourage people to experiment, have a go, learn from doing? Because if you haven't, some of the principles that Agile is built on just won't flourish. So yeah, it was that kind of realization of, this is really interesting. I have a language set, something I think I've spent quite a bit of my career actually doing. So, and that's kind of where a few things fell into place for me in terms of how I can genuinely add value into this space, which I'll be honest, I was struggling with from time to time because I don't have that deep Agile background, or at least I didn't think I had until I started joining some dots together.
So it sounds like a huge role you stepped into and a huge transformation project. How did you know where to start?
Very good question. I suppose at the very, very beginning, we were guided by another organisation who gave us expertise and direction in the space. And I think in those days, it was very much learning, and it was very much being as part of the conversation, observing a lot. But I think the bit for me that really started to boil this down to was actually work at the team level, because that's where this kind of really starts. There are so many associated themes and things to go after that knowing where to start can be really difficult. But if you haven't got your team set up at the very base of the system, you have no fundamental foundations. So a lot of where we really started was some quite basic places of have we got the team set up? Do they have required roles, i.e. a Scrum Master or a product owner? Where they don't, how are we supporting to go get them with the right capability and introducing them to the business and inducting them into the way we're working? Alignment on the ceremony cadence. Are people following it? And if they're not, how are we helping them to understand? So there were some real basics, to be brutally honest. There wasn't necessarily anything particularly novel or new. Lots of other organizations have done this. But if those foundational elements at the team level are not in place, you're really going to struggle, I think, elsewhere. That being said, I think one of the things that was a huge benefit of ours was we had the direction that had came from the very top. So that gave us permission to go do a lot of stuff in a lot of ways. So that what we had, I think, at that point was a nice blend of prioritization at a senior level, but this is really important. And we also had mobilization at the team level, which allowed us to get traction quite quickly, actually, which was a big part of what we were trying to do.
It's really interesting. And there's so many questions. It's really fascinating, that sort of the similarities you're noticing between sort of Agile and OD. How do you get like a manufacturing organization where everything is about certainty to move to an approach which is more about iteration? How does that happen? Obviously, it sounds like senior management played a significant role in this.
Yes, yeah. I think it would be fair to say we're still on that journey, and it is a part of our challenge at the moment as you move further right through our development system and move into more of a manufacturing space, which is a live bit of work we've gone on at the moment. You do end up ultimately moving into a more lean-based environment where things are actually more repetitive, and it isn't about continuous iteration and redesign and redevelopment. And so that journey is what we've been trying to chart as we've been going through. So, but it's one of the really interesting things I think that I've certainly learned a lot about over the course of the last few years, that there is a bit of a fallacy, I think, or certainly I've observed in some places and instances, that Agile is almost a bit of a, well, go do what you want type of thing, because you're empowered and you're best placed to know what you want to do. And actually, when you do it really well, what it really drives is genuine alignment and prioritization. So actually, it's not so much about empowering teams per se, but it is enabling them to be self-managing, which I think is a really important distinction. So because the premise of what a vehicle isn't for individual teams to create, because, well, I'm not quite sure what would appear at the end. A lot of that has to be done upfront and aligned before you get teams starting to really get into the details of executing it. The real trick is, how do you get the right people with the right skill set who are much more knowledgeable to actually design what is being asked and test it and deal with the problems and be the experts who know everything there is to know about body systems or software systems or whatever it might be. And the biggest challenge is, how do you unify a vast group of people and synchronize all of the activity? That's actually one of the biggest things in what is fundamentally a very complex product in a car. Doable, but I think we're still, a few years on, still working our way through some of our core foundational frameworks and how do they support, but in some instances, how do they maybe not support, and are there any changes we need to make in terms of that iterative release of value as you kind of go through.
So interesting, isn't it? And I think you said something which is like doing Agile properly, and it's almost like strategy. Agile to many organizations has kind of lost its meaning. It's been twisted and turned to suit the context. We've been in organizations where they said, oh, we're Agile, and they're actually hot desking. They've just taken everyone's. That's not Agile. There is a way of doing it and the discipline behind it as well. What was your journey into OD then? It sounds like you've had sort of a fascinating career too now. How did you find OD, or did OD find you?
Probably a bit of both, I guess. Like I said, I think from a very early stage, how things fit together was always sort of in my sort of thinking, I suppose. So it wasn't ever just about, there is this particular problem in the organization. I suppose intuitively, I always went to look behind the curtains to go, well, is that the actual problem, or is that just the symptom? And therefore, if that's the symptom, there's got to be a root cause somewhere. And how do I go poke around to go find out about what the root cause is? And I guess just a natural curiosity of wanting to find out more about how do you solve the underlying problem as opposed to just the symptom that's presenting itself. And a bit to the Agile point, I suppose, and it goes back to something Danny referenced in terms of when we first met at Roffey Park. I suppose that's the bit where OD found me a bit, where I was fortunate enough through our organisation to go on that practitioner's course. And again, that kind of gave a bit of a structure to something I think I'd been practicing for a while, but again, probably without really knowing it. That probably lit a bit of a fire in terms of, there's more to this, I think, than just poking around and asking some questions. There's a structure, there's a framework, there's different ways of addressing problems. There are different schools of thought, some of which don't align and have very differing views on how to go about doing it. And then ultimately, fast forward a few years later, I'd actually go one step further and then ended up doing my master's at Roffey Park, which again was brilliant because that further embedded some of the learning I think I'd put in place great cohort of people, great environment to learn, and that environment nurtures that kind of thinking about how do systems come together, but with a very strong humanistic lens. And I guess that's the bit that's kind of always blended with me, which this isn't ever just about mechanics of a system. A system only works as well as the people in it. And certainly, when I put my HR hat on, the one thing I've learned, or I learned very quickly and continue to learn, is people are complicated. And I'm always minded of something. So someone said to me at the very start of my career, Jag, your job is actually easy. It just becomes complicated the moment people enter it. And that's just the nature of people, isn't it? We all come at things with very different lenses, different beliefs, different views. And it's a double-edged sword of embracing all of that to create a truly inclusive, diverse conclusion of some degree of description, versus sometimes it'd be a lot easier if everyone just thought the same and we could just get something done and tick it off. And that's I guess that's the tussle that I've always recognized in OD, that there is no easy way through it. And again, I'm still minded of a couple of early interactions with, at Roffey Park, where actually even the term OD was being discussed and referred to as something that does exist or doesn't exist. Is it something that sort of the OD field have created for the purposes of themselves? Does it mean anything to the organizations that you're working in, etc.? Some of that was great to explore as well. And that's why I think I found a bit of a landing spot between both, where, driven through me is quite a strong operational lens of going to get stuff done. There are some big projects and programs we've had to deliver against certain timescales. And at the same point, how do you use OD as a way of, a bit to something you was, a question you asked earlier, Danny, in terms of where do you start? How do you use something that allows you to sort of pinpoint, here's the question that's actually being asked, or the problem that is actually being solutionized for. Now, how do you build an approach out for there? So it started to give, for me, the bit that I sort of took to it most is it started to build a bit of a scaffold that allowed you to investigate problems in a more structured way, rather than necessarily just, diving around and having a bit of a route and asking some questions, in the spirit of solving genuine business problems, as opposed to an OD practitioner having a nice time and asking some interesting questions. I think the outcomes bit has always been the really important bit to me. There's the so what question that sits at the back of it.
Yeah, being really grounded in reality, the operational reality and the business, what the business is trying to achieve. Brilliant. So one thing we like to ask everybody who comes on, because we're trying to demystify kind of roles a bit, what does a typical week look like? We used to ask what a typical day looked like, but that's
we gave up on that.
We gave up on that. So what does a typical week look like for you in terms of what you're actually doing?
I'm not sure I can even answer that one, if I'm honest, because I think a bit of that, a bit tongue-in-cheek, but is the nature of what we do in terms of being in a transformational background, that I guess quite honestly, no one week is ever quite the same. But I guess, the typical type of activities is a lot of time spent with the team to try and create genuine alignment on what we're trying to do. That in itself has been a journey to be able to get done properly. And I think I've learned a huge amount about myself in terms of ability to do that in a big, complex program. A lot of time with stakeholders to get their alignment, and how we, again, pull that together. Increasingly, what I'm trying to do is actually dedicate a bit of time to generally do some thinking before just lurching from one thing to the next, which I have done before. And ultimately, I think, there is also space during the week where literally problem solving. So this is the latest thing that's come up. How do we deal with that latest question, issue, etc.? So that inevitably takes quite a bit of time up, because they're not straightforward answers in most cases. And unfortunately, in a lot of instances, people ask me questions and I don't know the answer. So the job is going out and finding others who do and help engage in that conversation to at least create a route forward.
And that's a really important thing, having time to think, because in that thinking time, I guess you're trying to anticipate problems, trying to think through different approaches and whatnot as well. But sometimes, we think of it as a little bit indulgent to have that time, or having the discipline of like saying, look, Thursday afternoons between 2 and 5. Don't interrupt me, I'm going to be thinking. How easy is it to find that space in your diary to do, and what do you call it so no one disturbs you?
Well, I just block it out and put private so no one can actually see what's in it. I guess is a very tactic I probably shouldn't have actually said out loud. But it's literally as brutal as that, because I agree with you. Actually, I had a reflection just a few weeks ago where, for one reason or another, my entire day emptied out. So I had this whole day to myself, which as a largely introverted character, I couldn't have asked for anything more. It was just brilliant. And I did get to probably about lunchtime, and I questioned myself about what value have I added over the course of the morning, because this paper I'm trying to write, I've written 2 paragraphs. So in terms of genuine output, but what I'd given myself is time to actually thumb through a few books or articles that have always been there that I kind of want to refer back to. I started paragraphs several times and rewrote them, but it's interesting reflection in my own patterns of behavior to say that because I haven't been super busy answering issues, going from meeting to meeting, answering calls, etc., that therefore am I working hard, which I thought was it was an interesting reflection on myself. But what I do try to do is block out at least typically 3 hours at some point during the week, and I've started to get a bit of a standard pattern behind it, and put myself in a quiet place. So typically, mainly probably at home, which tends to work. But I'm always minded, and again, it's one thing that I've been trying to practice more and more of myself. Is even then you can get distracted. So Teams messages pop in, your phone rings, whatever. So that again is a practice I'm trying to improve on, about trying to block out that time, because I do get real value from it. And more importantly, it's value created for others to enable that clarity and alignment, which, like I said, has been one of the biggest challenges in what we have been doing.
And we're going to send a copy of that to so many people. It's so important.
Yeah.
Just don't tell them about the blocked meeting notice.
But it is that kind of, how do I create value? And particularly when you come from the operation where there's kind of action-based cycle, aren't we? Whereas it's like the value that you're creating, like rarely does a team give itself a high five when they prevented something from never happening. It's a different kind of feeling of adding, making things better, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So what do you enjoy most about your role?
I think the biggest thing I would say was I'd go back to the team, and when I watch people learn and grow and flourish for themselves, that's very much a moment to stand back and go, look what they're doing. And I wouldn't say that's out of intensive coaching through myself. It's a bit of nudge and nerdling. It's a bit of creating the environment, and then watching people take the opportunity and be able to deliver some great stuff is brilliant. And we have some magnificent people, and I'm lucky enough to work in my group with some fab people, some fab stakeholders, etc. And we go back to that outcome piece, not just do great work, but actually land great outcomes in the business. And I hear and I see the feedback from the business about that's a difference that this person or persons have made. It is probably the thing that drives me the most. But that's in the context of, are we making the business better? So like I said, we are still on a journey. Horrible phrase maybe, but we definitely are. And we still have a long way to go. But where you see bits of it coming together and you see things, starting to work, and you hear comments around levels of collaboration that people just have never seen before, or problem solving at an earlier stage of a program than we've ever seen before. That's the kind of stuff which says, I know we're onto the right thing. It's still a long way to go. Actually, this is a really hard slog, and you have loads of nagging self-doubt questions about, are we doing the right thing? Am I the right person to be doing this job, given my background and. But those little bits kind of keep you going. And it all, I suppose it comes back to that comment I made earlier. That's a very humanistic way of looking at things, which I suppose is a bit of my outlook around. Fundamentally, it's all about the people. If the people are getting on and the people are delivering, somewhere, somehow, the system will knit itself together. But watching people grow and knowing you've had even a small part of it is probably the best thing I would ever take out of a job like this.
Oh, sounds really satisfying. And I guess there's comparisons between sort of implementing Agile at scale and actually just creating culture change. What is the role of the managers, like sort of not necessarily the senior managers, but middle managers in making Agile work in this? And how have you had to engage with them to get them on board? Because these are busy people with a lot of BAU that you're adding more stuff on top, aren't you? What part do they play?
Huge. There is a real danger that you miss that population out. And I would probably say that is one of the things I look back on areas that I think we could improve on how we have gone about it. There are, to your point, Garin, elements of we've put stuff on top of managers, and whether we've made it easier or not, still a bit of work in progress, I think. And not unsurprisingly, we've got feedback from them to say that. They are critical though, because the bulk of the squads and the teams report up through to these people, so their influence is big. They have big teams in some instances, large reporting numbers, and a lot of responsibility in terms of delivery of some of the components or the systems that sit within our product. So I think I would say we've got more work to do on how we really galvanize that group, how we engage and entertain a conversation that really kind of distills where they are and what we need to do to continue to improve. Because I think I would always come back to the point that Agile also isn't magic. It doesn't solve every single problem, and in some instances creates other problems. And again, I think that's a little bit of a fallacy that, just sprinkle a bit of Agile on an organization and it will be brilliant. I go again back to the fact that unfortunately people aren't that simple, and some instantly take to it, some don't, some are sat on the fence and wanting to find a bit more and have a bit of social proof to demonstrate. And that is compounded by such a big population. Putting your arms around it is difficult, and that has definitely meant that I don't think we have serviced a lot of needs, but I don't think we've serviced all of the needs, which I know about and I can hear in the organisation when we go around talking to people. So I think that is the space we've got more work to do.
So you talked about it as a journey, and you've been working on this Agile transformation for 3.5 years now, and you see there's kind of more to come. How have you managed expectations internally about how long this is taking to do? Because often you get kind of organizations and senior leadership are just impatient to get things moving. How have you managed expectations around that?
I suppose partly I've got one slide that I keep showing to everyone to the extent that they're probably a bit bored, which is our overall, a very high level pathway that I talk about. So 3 big phases of work. The mobilization phase that I spoke about at the start, how do you get people started? The improve stage, which is what I think we're in now. We've mobilized the masses. We've still got a bit of work to do, and we need to think about how do you turn that into a business as usual process as new people join, graduates, apprentices, etc. But that's all in the spirit of we've got to get to an accelerate phase. But to accelerate, we've got to improve our base systems, approaches, etc. So that's very much where we are. The axis that runs across the bottom is one of time, and my axis runs out to 5 years, and that's the slide I show everyone. To get to acceleration, it will probably take us about 5 years to get there. That doesn't mean I don't get challenged on sooner, faster, quicker, and I think that's fair, in terms of that challenge into the system. But I guess there's a bit of a consistency of message around, and saying the same thing in multiple places, I think helps. Do I think we could try and go even quicker in terms of that maturity? Yeah. We need to think about how we would do it in a more focused approach. But as ever, any business, quite rightly, will be looking for a return on investment, and we're no different. So, the longer you talk about that investment being returned, the harder that conversation becomes internally.
Yeah, it's sort of exponential growth in systems. It just starts like that, then it's that acceleration phase, isn't it? But it's having the patience to stay to there as well. Brilliant. What does it take to get people working from different functions and different disciplines that see the world so differently, that may even be located in different geographies and different generations? How do you bring them together to work in the service of this? It's a big question, but I guess like when you think about that, what have been some of the lessons you've taken away?
But there's probably two bits to that. I think the first is I was also very fortunate enough to that at the same time as we were kind of embarking on this journey, there's also been a big journey about our behaviors, our culture, how do we show up as an organization. And again, I go back to what I said earlier, that's as much as Agile as ceremonies and cadence, Scrum, Kanban, etc. And that's really helped us because people have taken to that actually, and there is a noticeable shift. And the team that have been involved in it have done just an amazing job, really landing a new creators code, as we talk about it, our behavioural landscape. And that in itself has encouraged people to share and collaborate in a way that historically I haven't seen as much of over the years. So I think that gave a great foundation. What I've always, I suppose, spoken a lot about then is then when you overlay that with some of the ceremonies that we put in place, things like, sprint planning, sprint reviews, the showcases is a great one, which has really allowed us to, for people to show what they have achieved and celebrate it in a way we've never really done before. That allows those behaviors to be anchored in something and make them live. So it takes a great conversation out of a conference room or, a workshop, and in the workplace, this is how they live and they breathe. Managers and senior managers taking a step back and allowing teams to actually talk about their successes or talk about their problems in a way that we've never been able to do before. And that's where these two things I think fall together. There's a huge behavioral aspect of it. And like I said, I was a parallel program running and still running, which I think has been a massive enabler for us from an Agile perspective, and enabling and creating a system that allows those behaviors to live, breathe, and be anchored in, I think is a bit we are starting to see, like I said, much more work to do. But I firmly believe that's how you make things live and sustain. And I think we're on a pathway to be able to get there.
We've talked about what you enjoy. What do you find most challenging about the role that you're doing?
I think it is the ambiguity is probably a bit of a double-edged sword. So on one hand, I guess there's the curious, want to go find out more person that loves it. And there's also a bit about, it would just be really nice if we could just be really clear about what we want to do by Friday and get it done. And actually feel like we've done something, as opposed to drift around in space and explore and be not quite sure, and we stop and we start, which I think has been a little bit of the challenge sometimes. And again, I talk back to the piece I've referenced a couple of times about the learning curve I've been through in terms of genuinely creating alignment to allow people to know what they're doing, and for them to plan and to deliver that work. So sometimes clarity is a lovely thing that would be brilliant, to just sometimes make it, this is what we're going to do and we're heading in that direction. And we may find out in time, actually, that direction wasn't quite the right direction and we'll pivot. But I think sometimes you end up in a bit of a self-contained circle and you don't quite know which way you've ended up facing. And the challenge is you've got others looking at you to go, which direction are we going in, Jag? And you're like, I'm not entirely sure which way I'm facing. So, and that feels very uncomfortable when people are looking to you for some level of direction and guidance. And that in itself causes frustration in them. So navigating that ambiguity is probably the biggest challenge.
So when you think about success in your role, how do you measure success? How do you know you've done a good job or you're doing a good job?
Still standing at the end of the week. Probably,
always good.
Sometimes that's an achievement.
Yeah, has been. I think there's that's probably a slightly boring narrative, I guess, through the context of this conversation about we're on a journey, and literally the call I was just on before I joined this was about metrics and measurement. And I think in the early days, a lot of our measurement was around adoption, and it was I guess very rudimentary to some degree, so we said we were going to mobilize X hundreds, thousands of people by these certain dates. Have we done it? Yes or no? I guess quite an easy way of measuring something. And then we started to move into a space about how well are people adopting the way of working, and have we got some of the basics in place? So are the basic ceremonies there? Are people using Jira, and are they using it to sort of map their stories in the most appropriate way, etc. So again, it was very much in the space of the measure that was required at that point in time, because we weren't mature enough to measure anything more. Now there's a very real conversation, as we have now collectively learned a lot, in terms of everyone involved in this. How do we really now start to know where delivering at speed we need to be able to deliver at? So you will hit some of the agile metrics in terms of predictability or velocity, and again, in the industry there's a whole debate about whether you should use them, shouldn't use them, they can be gamified, etc. And I think we're trying to, and I recognize some of those conversations, I think we're just trying to chart a way through in terms of what makes sense for us. But we go back to the kind of return on investment piece. How do we know we're actually now better, quote unquote, whatever that kind of looks like in terms of speed of delivery or the achievement of value at more iterative phases? And it's those kind of measures we're really trying to get embedded now, utilizing the Scrum Master population that we've built and using their collective knowledge to help drive some of that. But again, doing it in the right way. So this is the really important thing for me. It isn't a top-down edict that then the measures are used for corrective purposes in terms of you haven't done it right, and it's very much a stick. Actually, and this is, go back to, I guess, other running theme from a cultural perspective. How do you use those metrics to help learn and improve? So it's now showing up, this bit of the system isn't working well. Okay, so I'll go back to, again, something I said, why? What's happening? Is it a process? Is it the people? Is it the system? Is it the tooling? What is it that would allow us to make an improvement? And when we make an intervention, again, allow us to measure it, to know that because of that intervention, we have done something better. That's the place we're really on the cusp of now trying to get in place, so that we can try and get our arms around a measure across the whole system. But again, I go back to such a vast system is quite a challenge. And as ever, your data out is only ever as good as your data in. And like any, we're no different to lots of other big organizations our size and scale. Managing data is an interesting journey, but critical. We can't, at the very heart of it, again, if there's a couple of things I've learned out of this, the requirement to be empirical and demonstrate return of value is foundational. And if we can't do that, it's a much, much more difficult story to tell. We've got some great qualitative feedback, like I said earlier, about, greater levels of collaboration, how people are feeling at work. Our ENPS scores are on a upward trajectory, sort of really positive. So people are feeling happier, and the data is telling us, in the main. We still, like I said, have our challenges. Now we've got to move on to that next level of empiricism to really demonstrate, are we moving in the right direction? And can I demonstrate to our stakeholders that we're moving in the right direction, and that this is definitely a path to still stay the course on?
And I guess just one question. So not everyone will be in the situation where they can actually go all in on Agile. They may be just leading a team or leading a function or an area. And you've referenced some of the sort of the classic Agile tools, retrospectives, ceremonies, sprints. What of those are sort of standalone tools have you found? Yeah, they are so good. If I wasn't working in an Agile organization, I would really get my teams to implement them, because they really do make a difference.
Probably a couple. So one is one you just mentioned, the retrospective. So I think, again, I look back across large parts of my career, and lessons learned, and then you sort of really question whether we have learned that lesson or not. And so the ability to stand back and actually reflect what worked, what didn't, what would we do differently next time, and most importantly, use that for future work is for me is brilliant. And it's that it's one of those things I think almost becomes, it feels in some instances like a nice add-on, but for me has become foundational, but both in terms of the work we do, but also from a personal level, to be able to sit back and go, that was really good. Yeah, that wasn't so good, Jag, really, was it? If I really look at it at the cold light of day, and the feedback I've got from others would tell me that wasn't particularly good. So whether you call it a retrospective, reflection, lessons learned, it's the essence is the same. So that is definitely one. But the other one, I think, which is, again, something I've got an increasing level of passion about, is the whole concept of planning, which I think is an undervalued skill in lots of organizations. And again, what I referenced earlier, that there is a slight fallacy in the agile world that it's all, turn up on a Monday, decide what you're going to do this week because you're adding value and, you're innovative and you're sort of on fire. But having the ability to really articulate, what are we trying to go for? When are we trying to go for it? How will we know we get there? And what's it going to take to get there? I think are skills that will mark the difference between organizations in the future that will go on and be hugely stellar successful and those that may not, because that allows you to organize your people and resources in a way that is at its most efficient. And you can see a lot of that happening at the moment in terms of just some of the challenges economically. We've slipped into recession, etc. No surprise, lots of organizations are just scaling back investment and funding, etc., and are now looking for said efficiencies. And I think a lot of it is within organizations' grasps already, if they could get their arms around what genuine planning meant, and then ultimately allowing teams to plan for themselves. And that, for me, is the holy grail of how this whole thing can work. So again, whether you use an agile cadence or not actually isn't necessarily important, but being visual in your work, transparent about where you are, highlighting your problems, knowing there are opportunities to ask for help when you're blocked. Those are all the fundamental elements, I think, that are part of it. But the planning bit, I think, is actually I generally increasingly think it's an undervalued skill, but for me could well be the marker between good and great.
So just a couple more questions for you. So you mentioned Roffey Park at the beginning. So you've done some learning there. How do you invest in your own learning and development now? What does that look like for you?
I try to read quite a lot. I do have a bit of a problem that I tend to start about 4 books at the same time, and I get confused between them. But I think it's that's been a biggest source for me. Just literally working my way through lots of books, blogs, but going out to meet people in the industry, people who've done it, different organisations. To us, their lessons. What have they learnt? What if I were you, Jag? This is the thing I would never do. Interestingly enough, still went and did them. So that's again been an interesting process. To the reflection point earlier, I'm not quite as disciplined as I like to be in terms of getting my thoughts down onto paper and journaling, but I do tend to do that on a fairly frequent basis, because for me there is a point about getting stuff out of my brain through my arm into a pen on a piece of paper and then seeing what's there and then reflecting back on it, but leaning into lots of other people and leaning on their experience. So again, danger of repeating myself on various fronts, but leaning on people who have got a deeper agile background and can talk much more well and articulate how to do estimation properly or how to write a story in Jira. I'm not sat here pretending I've got that sort of real depth of knowledge, but just listening to people like that and observing things and noticing what could I do that would help me do my job a bit better, and more broadly, just generally be a all-round good person, I suppose. Both in terms of the great concept I read earlier this week, actually, about the concept of the portfolio life replacing the whole concept of work-life balance, which I thought was really interesting. And I think it is broadly in that perspective, without necessarily getting into the weeds of the technicalities of it. It's now all very much intermingled and blurred, I suppose. So I try to look at things as holistically as possible. And when I do read, sometimes they're not just books on Agile, for example, but they're broader books on spirituality or philosophy or history to some degree, or to degree of description. So I kind of go broad. I need to actually start finishing some of the books I start, though, is probably the biggest thing.
We really want to inspire the next generation of OD practitioners coming through. So they may or may not have OD in the title. They may be working internally, they may be working externally. But what advice would you give someone who's starting out in OD now?
I think first and foremost, just be curious. That's the biggest thing. And apply quite a critical thinking lens. Always ask the question why. Or what is this there to serve? Never be satisfied with the answer you get first time round, because inevitably there's an answer that goes behind it. Just follow your nose in some instances and follow your instincts, because I think a bit to the Agile space, that there are different schools of thought in the OD world. and some you will lean to more than others. That's not to say the others are wrong by any stretch. That's just a position people take. But again, from a curiosity perspective, I think there was something that definitely resonated when I started. I guess particularly masters at Roffey Park of different schools of thinking, which just opens your eyes up to different constructs, and then challenging those constructs, because just because someone's written about them doesn't mean they're right, per se. And I think, but all in the context of, if people are interested in creating great working environments that offer real value for people in terms of how they see themselves fitting into an organization, how do you create optimal organizations that allow those people to fit in them, then I think, whether OD is formally in your title or not doesn't necessarily matter, because a bit like I said, I think I was doing that stuff and didn't know until someone told me that there's this field called organization development. And I wouldn't let that prohibit you. I think it's, be curious first and foremost. And it's amazing where just asking some questions can sometimes lead you.
Jag, I want to say a huge thank you. I've really enjoyed this. I want to say thank you for answering all our questions with real precision and care as well. I think people watching this will have got so much value from it. I think some of the things I'm going to take away from it is like, your job is easy until people enter the equation. Dedicating time to do the thinking, the importance of blocking good quality time out, 2-3 hours, and making sure that you're aware that you're actually creating value while you're doing that, away from the operational aspect of it. The importance of middle managers in change and engaging them in the process, and empathizing with their challenges, and also finding measures that record impact that allow people to steer the job and steer the system, rather than it being a sort of a top-down measure as well. Also, the importance of retrospectives and planning is an undervalued tool that we bring to organizations. And I love these last things: be visual in your work, be transparent with where you are, be curious, follow your nose, and follow your instincts. So I think people will got taken so much from this. So thank you, Jag.
No, it's not a problem at all. Really enjoyed it. First podcast, so it's a great experience.
I have a feeling this might be your
another
last.
way for me to learn.
I was going to say, I think that might be the first of many. It has been a fab conversation, so thank you.